Thank all of you for joining. Tonight we have Dr. Sigve Tonstad zooming in with us. He is a professor at Loma Linda, both in medicine and theology, and he's written some really excellent books on the scriptures, including one on the lost meaning of the seventh day, as well as saving God's reputation, and a commentary on the book of Revelation. And he is someone who, in my estimation, has a deep curiosity about the Bible and thinks deeply about the things of God. So we're extremely excited to have him with us. And tonight's going to be kind of a more informal discussion on just the Sabbath and some of the important themes of the book. So thank you so much, Dr. Tonsad, for being with us tonight. Really appreciate
Thank
it.
you for having me.
Like, what led you to write this book and to kind of get so deep into the meaning of the Sabbath?
Yeah, so I have been interested in the Bible, maybe even from my younger years, and when I and I was a theology major as an undergraduate, but I did some influences. On my life made me decide to go to medical school, and I didn't think I knew what I was interested in. I didn't know what sort of career I would have. I just knew I was interested in the Bible, and after starting medical school, I got very interested in medicine. I'm very happy I did that. But so while I did my residency in internal medicine here at Loma Linda, I took a class in Old Testament theology from a very prominent Adventist teacher, Nils Erik Andreasen. He has been president of Andrews University for 20 some years, but he was a teacher here at the time, and I wrote a paper for his class on the Sabbath, and 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 that's kind of what got me going, because when you write a paper about stuff, there is a thing about theology that you might just think, well, I'm going to show what I believe, I'm going to explain my beliefs. But there is also a risk when you start looking at texts that you might discover that you didn't understand those texts correctly, that as you get deeper into those texts, you change your mind. So I worked on my that manuscript. First, it was a pretty hefty term paper to begin with, and then I thought, well, I'm going to make it into a book, and then I revised and revised, and the project grew, and I changed my approach. You could say partway through, I I probably changed from an emphasis on the rightness of the Sabbath to the meaning of the Sabbath. And the last part became bigger and bigger because I discovered, wow, there are many meanings here that we haven't talked about. So then I ended up with the title, The Lost Meaning of the Seventh Day. It took me 18 years to get, before I had it published. And when it was published by the what you might call the premier Adventist publisher, Andrews University Press. So it was published in some ways as an academic book, but I also, wished to make it readable. Uh, so, but there was a dearth. There is a lack of serious academic books too on Adventist topics, including the Sabbath. So, I think I think my book actually filled that niche. It was 30 years between another book and mine, and anyway, so yes, I was interested in the topic, and it became a journey of discovery for me too. So the Sabbath grew on me and its meaning, and I'm just very fond of that topic. I have also now written the chapter on the theology of the Sabbath in the Oxford Handbook of Seventh-day Adventist Theology that was published last year. So maybe I have established a little bit of a reputation to be a Sabbath, voice about the Sabbath. That was a long answer. Sorry.
Oh, great answer. So, kind of like, what were your, I guess, early experiences with the Sabbath, and how did you like develop a fondness for it?
Yeah, my early experience is that I grew up in a Seventh-day Adventist home and in a village in Norway, and we were the only Adventist family there. Most people in that village are Lutherans, and maybe 1/3 of people are religious or attending church to some extent, and most people are not religious. But our family was quite religious and my dad was quite a strict, had quite strict ideas about how to keep the Sabbath, and that was a mixed experience. We had wonderful Sabbath meals. My mother was an amazing cook, and we had real fancy Sabbath dinners. And friends that knew that we had those fancy dinners, they would come after we had our Bible studies on Sabbath morning. They would come for the dinner, especially for the dessert. but I think I had to grow a little beyond my Sabbath experience as a child, because, as I said, there was a kind of strict discipline about you can't do this, you can't do that. So, so my Sabbath theology now is not the main thing. Is not the strictness or faithfulness in our Sabbath keeping. It is really the Sabbath as a mediator of God's faithfulness to us. That I consider the primary meaning of the Sabbath. But maybe we can get into some passages
Yeah,
in the Bible to show why that could be the main emphasis.
sure. I think one of the passages you mentioned is in John chapter 5, right? Of the story of Jesus healing the man um, on the Sabbath, and he says, um, oh, do I have the verse here? Um, 5 verses 17 or 5 verse 16. For this reason, the Jews persecuted Jesus and sought to kill him because he had done these things on the Sabbath. But Jesus answered them, saying, my Father has been working until now, and I have been working. So, yeah, what is your understanding of that passage and how it might speak to God's faithfulness of being represented in the Sabbath?
Yeah. Yeah, so first of all, those two chapters in the Gospel of John, chapter 5 and chapter 9, they are the most extensive discussions of the Sabbath in the whole Bible.
Mm.
That includes the Old Testament. One might say, oh, Sabbath theology is mostly Old Testament Sabbath theology. You have the Ten Commandments, you have the creation story, you have other mentions of the Sabbath in the Old Testament, but in the Gospel of John, you have Jesus doing prominent acts of healing on the Sabbath, and you have controversy about the Sabbath in the context of two sides in a controversy where both sides believe that the Sabbath is important, but they do not believe in the same meaning.
Mm.
So Jesus' critics are not anti-Sabbath. They think he is in violation of something, and Jesus is not. He is not disregarding the Sabbath. He is choosing the Sabbath. He is sort of seeking out the Sabbath to do these acts of healing. So in John chapter 5, the man who has been paralytic for 38 years, it is to me quite likely that Jesus knew that area of town, that he had been there before. It says that he knew he had been sick for a long time. That is what the text is saying. And then there are two elements in the text where you could say, well, if he had done that, there would have been no problem, or if he had done that, there would have been no problem. So what are those two elements? Well, if he had not done it on Sabbath, there would have been no problem, because they are angry with him because he did it on the Sabbath. And if he had not told the man to carry his mat, because that's what gets attention. So he could have said, well, I'm going to heal you, but I have to do it on another day. I'm coming back. He could have whispered in his ear, don't just hang in there. I will come back and heal you. Or he could have said, I'm going to heal you, but you must not touch that mat, because if you carry that mat on Sabbath, we will have a lot of trouble. But Jesus doesn't do that. He heals the man on the Sabbath, and he tells him to carry the mat, which is kind of like a red flag for that sort of view of Sabbath keeping. And that is also challenging to Sabbatarian views or Adventist Sabbatarian views on the Sabbath too, because we tend to say, as the Old Testament does, that the Sabbath is a day of rest, don't we? God rested on the seventh day. That is the mantra in the Old Testament. Jesus, when he defends his Sabbath healings in John chapter 5 in John, he says, my Father is working, and I am also working. So that is a sign of commitment. That's why I'm saying the Sabbath is a mediator of a divine commitment. And that divine commitment is manifest mostly for people who are marginalized, the most vulnerable, because in those times, if you were sick, you might have sinned, or if you were sick, you might be under a curse. So when Jesus approaches that man in chapter 5 of John, he talks to him and he says, would you like to get well? And the man, and I'm just quoting part of the man's answer, the man says, I have no one, sir, I have no one. It means that he is abandoned. He doesn't have anyone who can help him. They had this idea that the water would be stirred up, and if you got into the water first, then you got healed. That's an explanation that may have come later in the text. Maybe it wasn't there in the original. But that is also part of the predicament of this man. He is ill, 38 years, maybe you stop thinking that you will get well after 38 years. Those of you who will become doctors, you will have patients with chronic illness, and some patients have been ill for much of their life, and this is that kind of a person. And then Jesus shows up, and the man who has no one suddenly has someone, because Jesus comes into the picture and Jesus delivers a blessing to that man when his rationale is the kind of person God is. My Father is working until now, and I am also working. And the sort of beauty of this in the context of the Gospel of John is that Jesus in the Gospel of John is the revealer of the kind of person God is. Chapter 1 in Gospel of John, no one has ever seen God, but the only begotten, who is God and who is in the bosom of the Father, he has shown us what God is like. He has brought knowledge of God to us in a very powerful and definitive way. So then you could say, if I could go on just a tiny bit more on this question, so you could say that Jesus, because it was very controversial, and you read the text that says they started persecuting him, and they persecuted him even more after he had explained what he did, because he made himself like God, and he said that God was his father, and so on. So the Sabbath controversy, that Sabbath healing, reverberates, echoes in the Gospel of John till the end of the chapter. This is where it begins. This is where the road to Calvary somehow begins in the Gospel of John, over the matter of the Sabbath healing. So Jesus could have said after that, could have said, I really made a mistake there. I wish I hadn't done that. I shouldn't have. I should have known that they wouldn't like, me to do that. But that option isn't there, because in chapter 9 in the Gospel of John, he's out on a Sabbath walking with his disciples, and they see someone who is born blind. That's even worse than being ill, for 38 years. They see this man born blind, and the disciples ask him, who sinned? Was it him or was it his parents? So they have this idea that ailments, handicaps, like blindness, that is a consequence of someone's sin, like a punishment or something. And then, of course, Jesus answers by saying that it wasn't him and it wasn't his parents, and it isn't as though there is a relationship between sin and sickness, but let that glory of God be revealed on him. And then he decides to heal the man on the Sabbath, and he says that we must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. So I mentioned that in the Old Testament, the verb that goes along with the Sabbath is rest. God rested, God rested, God rested. We should rest on the Sabbath. But that is not the verse in the Gospel of John. My Father is working until now, and I am also working. We must work the works of him who sent me while it is day. Night is coming when no one can work. So I hope you get this point, because it is quite a critical point. This is the Sabbath as a mediator of revelation. It doesn't mean, you go to work, you work on the road, you drive a bus, you go. It is not work in a kind of menial sense that is meant. It is the work of revealing the kind of person God is, and to reveal God's presence in the world. I have always been quite happy, actually, as a doctor, when I have been on call on Sabbath, because I felt, well, that's the place to be. When you have that sort of theological background. And then in the Gospel of John, chapter 9, then Jesus bends down and spits on the ground and takes some dust, some earth, and makes a dough of clay, and he smears it on the man's eyes. And if you think of in terms of, if one of you becomes a doctor, an eye doctor, an ophthalmologist, you will lose your license if you treat a person's eyes like that, and smear stuff on such a sensitive organ as the eye. But the figurative meaning there is beautiful, isn't it? Because Jesus is play acting. He is acting like he is the creator in the gospel. In the book of Genesis, God took dust from the earth and formed man, and he became a living being. So Jesus is in some ways acting as a creator, as the revealer of the kind of person God is, yes, he is acting as though he was that person in Genesis who created man from or human beings from the dust of the earth. And actually, someone already in the 4th century, Gregory of Nyssa, one of the Cappadocian fathers, he saw that connection and pointed that out, that there was that Jesus acts out that story in Genesis. So again, though, to sum this up, and we have not the controversy in chapter 9, it goes on and on with, oh, is this your son? Oh, was he born blind? It is a very intriguing exchange afterwards. But the short of it is that Jesus has mediated to marginalized, abandoned people the presence of God and the commitment, the divine commitment. So I say in my sort of summary, and maybe I've said it better after my Sabbath book came out, but I meant it to be in my Sabbath book too, that is the Sabbath a divine commandment? Yes, it is a divine commandment. Is the Sabbath a divine commitment? Commandment versus commitment. The Sabbath is a divine commitment. It is a mediator of a divine commitment. And which of those two should have pride of place? Which of those two should loom larger? And my answer will be, it is the Sabbath as divine commitment. That is more than the Sabbath as divine commandment, if you can see that distinction. But thank you for mentioning those texts in the Gospel of John. I do not think they have gotten the attention they deserve in terms of shaping Sabbath theology, period, Adventist or no Adventist. But those texts really, really do need to come out now, because we live in a world where many people wonder about the presence of God and the sense of God's absence, and these texts help us bring something hopeful into the picture.
Yeah, I had a question. So when I shadowed this doctor over the winter, he's also Seventh-day Adventist, and he mentioned that I think one of the things that was quote unquote taboo to talk with patients was like politics and like religion. So in like the religion aspect, how do you go about like caring for your patients while trying not to like address religion, or do you?
Well, that yeah, to in the role of the doctor, the physician doctor relationship, there is a contract, as it were, that you have a kind of expectation that the patient has of you. What is your primary role? What is it? What is it that brings that patient into your life, into contact with you? And that the answer there is that it's that patient's need, that patient's medical need, physical need, uh, And yes, we in Loma Linda, we have this notion of whole person care. So you can also, ask people about what sort of resources they have to deal with challenges, existential issues. But I am a firm believer that we must respect the patient's expectations, what sort of the doctor role, and 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 you can be a kind of Jesus in a person's life without talking about religion. In my view, you can deliver the best medical care that is possible to do. You can be a conscientious, attentive, compassionate person, And then, of course, my role is a little different because, now in this day, this time, we have the internet, and some patients I have had, they've said to me, "Oh, I Googled you." I Googled you and I found that you have written these books, and then my secret is out, Yes, I wrote those, but my belief is that we mediate healing, and we don't necessarily need to, what should I say, witness or evangelize. We feel our way, in the relationship to a patient, and sometimes people do ask more questions and theological, issues about spiritual life and so on. There are people in Loma Linda who want to push so-called spiritual issues more than I do, because I just want to make sure I do not violate that patient doctor contract, the expectation that the patient have of me, that I should give them good medical care. I need to meet that expectation first, and I think that is also what should I call it, spiritual care. But you will probably, if you go into medicine, you will participate in discussions about questions like that, and find a way that makes you comfortable, one way or another. There is a more space in America to talk with patients about spiritual matters than there is in Norway. But even in Norway, we also work with hospital chaplains, and I consider them as a very valuable companion and a member of our team. But just to bring it back to Sabbath, because I have been so blessed by those passages in the Gospel of John, chapter 5 and chapter 9 in John, and seeing Jesus there as a healer on Sabbath at the pool of Bethesda, and healing the man born blind, I have felt the happiest day of the week for me in the hospital has been Sabbath, because there is less going on and there is more chance for me to spend time with my patients, to finish rounds, make sure I make all those decisions that I should make. And then I can go back to the patients, sort of circle back into the rooms and get to know them a little more. I have thought that was really, really special. And I'm so glad that I have that extra Sabbath dimension to my care paradigm. But that means that the Sabbath then isn't just a day of rest. You see that. You see that for the doctor, you can say that I am there to mediate a sense of God's presence secondhand. I mediate something that is meaningful, maybe also spiritual meaningful to patients on the Sabbath.
Can I ask a question? Why do you think the Gospel of John and other Gospels connect the Sabbath with Jesus's work of healing?
Yeah. Well, I think that is in the character of the Sabbath. It must be that who is the better Sabbath theologian in the world? That it must be that the best interpreter of the meaning of the Sabbath must be Jesus, and he is, in the Gospel of John, the revealer of the kind of person God is, and the justification he gives for his Sabbath healing is, my Father is working until now, and I'm also working. So there is that divine commitment, and then there is also the contrast. Those other people who may see the Sabbath more as a divine commandment, his opponents, and or his critics, and and Jesus healings on the Sabbath also help correct misconceptions about God. So let's say that they say that it is not right to heal on the Sabbath, that you have to wait, or that you can sort of consolidate the idea that illness is a consequence of sin, personal sin, or the parent sin. So Jesus has to do something about that, because the Sabbath is also part of a sort of continuum of misconceptions about God. That picture of God that the others are mediating, and in those two stories in the Gospel of John, what has been the experience of those of the man, the paralytic, and the other person? Their experience has been the experience of God's absence. They are surrounded by all these Sabbath keeping people who obey and keep the Sabbath, and they wouldn't think of healing on the Sabbath. In fact, that is a capital sin, capital crime. And so here then we also have the contrast between God's apparent absence that might actually be aggravated by certain types of Sabbath keeping, and God's presence that is then driven home by another kind of Sabbath keeping, and the availability of people who care about others and do not see the Sabbath as a deterrent. So I think that there is a polemical element in the Sabbath controversies in the Gospel of John, in the Gospels period. In the Gospel of Luke, there is a healing of a woman who has been bent over, stooped for 17 years, and Jesus tells them, "Is it right to heal on the Sabbath?" And they look at him and are angry. And he says, shouldn't we do something for this person? This daughter of Abraham, she has been sick for 17 years. Think of it, 17 years, and then invoking then the Sabbath as a mediator of God's compassion. So these controversies are also helping us clarify meanings. I can't see any way around that.
One of the things that you really highlight in the book is like the Sabbath being enshrined in creation. And even in this sense of Jesus being a healer on the Sabbath, it's showing his commitment to sustaining his creation and to providing for his creation. So yeah, how do you understand the Sabbath as this high point in creation, and yeah, like what does it mean for the Sabbath to be enshrined in creation in your view?
So now we have talked mostly about New Testament perspectives and relational aspects of the Sabbath and the Sabbath healings of Jesus. And yes, I do think that should come first. But look at the Old Testament. Two specific issues in the Old Testament. Let's look at the Sabbath and creation care, the Sabbath and ecology. So you have a stipulation in the Sabbath commandment in Exodus, in chapter 20 in Exodus. There is the idea that Sabbath has a sort of comprehensive benefit to everyone, you and your son and your daughter and your slave and the stranger who is within your gates and your ox and your donkey and your ox, the beast of burden. So those So there is even a benefit for non-human creatures. There is a benefit for everyone. There is a sort of equality clause. I know that it is almost risky to say the words, what are they? Diversity and equity and inclusion, and I didn't say it because they are now taking it out of our language. But even if we remove it from the texts or that inform our ways now, you're not going to be able to remove those concepts from the Bible. Then you really have to dig deep if you want to, to change them there, because there you have all that in the Sabbath. Mind you, it is stipulated in the Sabbath, and then in Deuteronomy, chapter 5 in Deuteronomy, where the Ten Commandments is repeated. So there it isn't because God created the world in 7 days, as it in Exodus. There it is because I took you in Egypt and I led you out. You were slaves in Egypt. You were oppressed. I delivered you. I liberated you. So all of the other elements are there too, the inclusivity and the equality issues, but the rationale, the reason for it is the deliverance from slavery, the deliverance from oppression, and then all of Deuteronomy keeps that melody going. You must remember that. You must not forget that. You must have that as part of your faith identity in the present, even though you are not a slave anymore, even though you are not oppressed anymore. There was that history that is part of the believer's faith identity in the present. Why is that so important? Well, that is important so that you can empathize with those who are in that situation now, who are refugees, who are resident aliens, who are migrants, that kind of ethos. So, and then, so I did say that I was, this are, ecological issues. So, yes, there is that here on non-human care for non-human creatures in the Sabbath commandment. And then there is the Sabbath year. Every seventh year, there is rest for what? There is rest for the land, right? There is rest for the land. And God took that seriously, because when the Israelites go into captivity for 70 years, then Second Chronicles says that they are going to be in captivity for 70 years so that the land could make up for those Sabbaths it never got to have. 490 years of non-observance of the Sabbath year led to 70 years of captivity in Babylon. That's the arithmetic of that. So God was serious then about the ecological element in Sabbath theology. Can you see that? The care for the earth, the care for those who are marginalized, and they can kind of roam and pick the crops, but the landowner can't. So that to me is a huge lost meaning. And I am very disappointed, if I may say so, about the nihilism of many Adventists in relation to ecology, because there is that concern for creation care in Sabbath theology. And how in the world could we become so nihilistic and say, oh, the world is going to burn? No reason to take care of it. That is really, really not good Sabbath theology. So that's one of the Old Testament meanings. Then ecological, yes, social justice, liberty, empathy for those who are in vulnerable states now. And then, of course, the Old Testament ethos of the Sabbath is the social justice ethos, that if you read Amos, if you read Isaiah, they are talking about the Sabbath and social justice. So I have a chapter called the social conscience of the seventh day, don't I? And as a lost meaning, So we can show up and be at the table of many types of discussions and see that the Sabbath that we hold dear actually uh, makes us a legitimate presence in discussions about creation care and discussions about social justice. Again, I wonder why Adventists have somehow not wanted to see where they belong in these battles.
But to my question, you mentioned that when you're in the hospital on the Sabbath, that is like that's where you find the most peace. But I'm wondering, like in accordance to the Ten Commandments, you know how it says, remember the seventh day and keep it holy. And like basically do not work on the seventh day. But how does that like in turn conflict or complement the fact like are doctors allowed to work on the Sabbath? Like what does that mean to like is it really work if you're really caring for other people?
Well, they just to say in a Jewish Sabbath thinking, then there is a definitely, yes, acts of healing, people who are in states of need, they also have to be tended to, but it isn't just permission, permission to do that on the Sabbath. That yes, should one, if you are working out on the roads and doing road building or construction, you might say that is not necessary work on the Sabbath. So I would not say any work, any sort of labor is suitable on Sabbath. But I will say for medical care, there is no doubt about that. And you could say, well, what about elective surgery? I would say maybe elective surgery is elective. You might not do it on the Sabbath. But when I say that, I realize, of course, that the Sabbath healings that Jesus did in the Gospel of John were elective, because the person who had been ill for 38 years had a chronic illness. And we say about chronic illness that it is not a medical emergency. So you can't say that, I'm going to come back on Monday and we will deal with it, or you do what doctors do. Sometimes they say, take an aspirin and call me in the morning, and that you can defer that. I don't think that works in relation to medical needs. So I have found meaning in making those texts work for me. Weekdays in hospitals are usually very busy and very noisy and messy. Weekends tend to be more quiet. Yes, you can be very busy too, and you may have to work more because we are fewer hands, you have fewer people. But I have, if I may say it in a certain way, I have felt on Sabbath I have the patient to myself. Now we are not so many caregivers, we are fewer. And now you are my patient, and I have the sort of privilege of caring for you. So I would be very reluctant. I know there are people who say, "Oh, I don't work in the hospital on Sabbath," and some people might say that is how they wish to understand the Sabbath. That is not how I understand it. I have to say that I have just had wonderful experiences, giving care to people on the Sabbath. I had a patient once at the VA hospital here in Loma Linda who was a Jewish rabbi from the same town in Romania, in Transylvania, where Elie Wiesel, who is of course a major Jewish writer and Holocaust survivor. And Elie Wiesel used to be in that home. He used to run in and out of that rabbi's home. And I had time to sit down with this rabbi, who was also a Sabbath keeper, on a Sabbath and get to know all these wonderful things, just because I could be present for him in that setting. And he had a serious terminal illness, that rabbi. So I just those issues, one has to find out what is it that seems right for me. But the theology of the Sabbath in the New Testament cannot be that we leave to others to care for sick people on the Sabbath. That it cannot. I cannot see how that would work. Well, on the Sabbath we let others do it. By all means, I want to be part of that because of the way God wants to be present in the lives of needy people on the Sabbath, that he has not abandoned people. That seems to me to be quite an important thing. So.
Are there passages outside of the Gospels in the New Testament that add meaning for you to the Sabbath?
Well, there are stories in Acts of people seeming to gather on the Sabbath, fellowship. When Paul visits diaspora Jewish communities in Turkey, then there seems to be there is that those gatherings are points of attraction for him, and there isn't that much said in otherwise on the letters of Paul. There is some. I have a chapter in my Sabbath book about the Sabbath in Paul's letters, and I conclude that Paul's letters are also Sabbath affirming. So yes, I don't think one should leave that out. I also have a chapter on the Sabbath in Hebrews, and then of course in sort of ecological paradigm, to take that home in our interpretation of the Book of Revelation. And I already mentioned that I have written a commentary on the Book of Revelation for a non-Adventist publisher, and when Revelation ends by saying, "I saw a new earth," I say we should translate that, "I saw a renewed earth." It is this earth. It is not another earth. It is this earth. So it is a restored earth, a healed earth. And there is a kind of, in my view, a Sabbatarian tenor to that as well, because the earth then is going to be restored and not replaced. And we talk then about creation at the beginning of the story in the Bible, and recreation at the end of the story. So there is restoration there, and those are kind of bookends and they do have a Sabbath tenor. And let me make that even more explicit, since you asked, because I had to think about it a little, and I've been thinking about it when I was talking now. So in that chapter, in chapter 21 in Revelation, it says, "He shall be with them." God himself shall be with them and be their God. And that is in some ways the end game for the Sabbath journey in the Bible, that the yearning of God to come to rest with his people, and there are some strong echoes of that in the Old Testament, of God journeying toward Zion. He's going to Zion. I'm going to Zion. And in Revelation 15, I saw that Revelation 14 and 15, I think, but anyway, in the middle of Revelation, I saw the Lamb standing on Mount Zion. There is God coming to rest. That journey that is so pervasive in the Old Testament, of a journeying to Zion, where God comes to rest with his creation, and this is my resting place. This is where I want to be, so Revelation, I think, feeds into more in a more subtle way. Revelation also feeds into a Sabbath narrative that centers on God, that we also want the God we love and worship. We also want that God to rest at last. Jesus says, my Father is working until now, and I am also working. Well, isn't he going to rest at some point? Well, yes, in the book of Revelation, you might say that God, at the end, he shall be, arrive at the point, and the Lamb is on Mount Zion, and God is, he shall be with his people, and he shall be with them, and he shall be their God, and they shall be his people. I think that has a Sabbath tenor. There's a Sabbath connotation to those texts.
One of the ideas, one of my big takeaways, I think, from your book, and it was only in like the first few chapters, but it was this idea of the Sabbath kind of speaking and confirming God's purpose in creating human beings, and like the fact that the Sabbath occurs like the day after humanity is created gives us a hint as to why God created us to begin with. Could you speak to that idea?
Well, there is, I do draw on other people's thinking about that, and one of the great theologians of the 20th century, Karl Barth, who was not an Adventist, but he paid attention to meanings, and one of the people who succeeded him and just died last year, Jürgen Moltmann, is also someone who has paid attention to those Old Testament Sabbath perspectives. And Karl Barth, he says that in the Sabbath is an expression of God's love, that God stops working because he has found the object of his love and has no further need for works, that he has sort of, that was it, that there is a sort of reciprocity or a sense of fulfillment to God in creating human beings. We are created on the sixth day, and now God has found the object of his love and has no further need for works. I think that is quite striking. I am fond of quoting Barth on that one, and Moltmann, who has written on God and creation and has also returned to many Sabbath themes in his work, he says that there is a connection between Sabbath and Shekinah, the presence of God, that is sanctuary imagery. So the Sabbath at creation, at the beginning of the story, is prefiguring, it is already built into that Sabbath, what will happen at the end of the story. And again, it is God coming, the act of reconciliation and coming, that the figure of God resting with creation at the beginning comes then comes full circle with God's rest at the end. So I think that the chapter you refer to is the chapter where I discuss some of that. I think that is probably the chapter where I quote Karl Barth.
What do you think are like some of the consequences of society's abandonment of the seventh day?
Well, I think that that it runs really deep, that there is a fracture, a really deep fracture, and that the Sabbath is part of that of that fracture. So in Adventist Sabbath theology, the work of Samuel Bakioki was important. You know, he argues that Sabbath was replaced by Sunday, and that there was a kind of church tendency there, resurrection, you know, but the Sunday also had a pagan antecedent, you know, in the respect for the sun god and issues like that, and then and then he stresses then that in some ways the Sabbath is lost by church practice and to some extent by church decree. You know, now we're going to do Sunday. We're not doing the seventh day anymore. Now, I do not want to discount the importance of that argument. I think that is true. But what is also true is that the Christians, early Christians in the first centuries of Christian history, they were very much influenced by Platonic thought, the work of Plato and the thinking of Plato, and of course, as we know from that type of Greek philosophy, it's not the only kind of Greek philosophy that is out there, but there was a tendency to denigrate the physical world, the body, the earth, and to prioritize the soul, to say that human beings are mostly, we have an immortal soul, and we need to tend to the interest of the soul's immortality and so on. And the Christian fathers, they thought that was biblical. And one of the reasons why they thought it was biblical is because of a Jewish interpreter of the Bible whose name was Philo of Alexandria. And Alexandria was in those days the intellectual capital of the Greco-Roman world. It was a very huge center of influence. So Alexandria, one has to pay attention to it. It was like Boston or New Haven today. You know, that lots of people came there to study and were influenced by the things they learned there. So the Christian church fathers, they were influenced by Philo, and Philo was influenced by Plato. Philo did not see any problem between the Old Testament and Plato, even though there is a huge problem, because the Old Testament is earth affirming. It believes in the body and the earth. It doesn't believe that we have immortal souls. That is a totally false conception of the human person. But the Sabbath, as we know, celebrates the creation of the earth. The Sabbath celebrates the creation of human beings, and we become material beings. We became a living men. Humans became living creatures. We are physical, material beings. And then in the New Testament, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. Again, there is this materiality of the path of redemption. So the dualism that became so much a tenet of Christian thought that all of Christianity, through most of its history, has believed that we have immortal souls. And you die, but you don't die. You just leave your body and you go to heaven, and you are still you, even if you had to let go of your body. So, on that point, anthropology is very critical to Sabbath issues, because the Sabbath seems to me to safeguard a holistic anthropology where you cannot denigrate the body. You cannot believe that humans are mostly immaterial souls, and so on. So in my understanding, and I have developed that a tiny bit in my Sabbath book, that yes, you can argue like Bakioki did, that the Sabbath lost out to Sunday by almost more or less by church decree. But you can also say that for people who started believing that way about reality, that material, the world is not worth much, the body is dispensable, we get liberated from the body when we die. You could not do that with Sabbath theology. You need something else for that. Now, I'm not saying that's the whole story of why Sunday rose to replace it, but I do think that we must not explain the eclipse of the Sabbath narrowly. That's what I'm trying to say. That there is a broad sort of almost like a tsunami. Like the ground under your feet is shifting from an earth affirming view of reality, the earthiness of the Bible, of reality, to this otherworldliness that you have in Platonic thought, and what eventually became so much Christian thought that people have wondered that anyone ever believed anything else. I would say that is changing now, and there is in some ways a growing appreciation of the Sabbath, not necessarily the seventh-day Sabbath, but there is a sense, even in Sunday observing communities, a sense that something big was lost and we need to retrieve the meaning of the Sabbath. And you will not be surprised to hear me say that the meaning of the Sabbath goes along with the actual Sabbath. So you cannot divorce the Sabbath from its meanings. So I do think that these are fruitful venues for thinking about some Adventist distinctives, not just Sabbath, but also the anthropological thing, and from the anthropological thing, ecology. And yes, we already mentioned social justice too. Don't forget that.
Okay, cool. So one of the questions Xander had, he's not available to like unmute at the moment, but he was wondering how do you kind of support the continuity of the Sabbath, particularly like what's your evidence for early for Sabbath keeping in the early church?
Yes, I think I would point to the work of Bakioki has done quite a bit of documentation of of that, and there is also some work by Denis Fortin, who wrote an essay on Acts, evidence of Sabbath keeping in the community. In the book of Acts, we are talking first century things there, but that chapter that he has written, we have included it in a book that was published by the Adventist Society for Religious Studies, based on the conference we had in 2020. So that book, one can find it. It's called, the title of that book is It Matters How We Tell the Sabbath Story. It's called, I think it's called Remembering, and then subtitle It Matters How We Tell the Sabbath Story. It has many good chapters, and one of them is by my friend Matilda Fry, who has the keynote chapter for that project. But let's just say, in a sort of broader, more sort of framing of that question, that if you accept that the Sabbath is a mediator of the divine commitment, and that God makes good of that on that commitment, it would be quite unlikely that God would abandon the Sabbath. That the Sabbath is kind of constructed, designed to mediate the divine commitment, and will remain until that commitment has been brought to completion. So just to give a hint of how that might work. So there was what was his name now? Anyway, there was what's his name? That very famous preacher who used to preach a sermon called "It is Friday, Sunday is coming." Have you heard that sermon? Anyway, there's a notion that Friday is a very sad day, and Sunday, resurrection morning, is a very happy day. So there is a sort of a kind of sad tenor to Friday and a happy tenor to Sunday. Anyway, on Friday, in the story of Jesus, in the Gospel of John, when Jesus exhales and dies in the Gospel of John, he shouts tetelestai, it is finished. It is finished. And that is not a defeatist exclamation. It is the exclamation of a winning person. So it isn't a sad exclamation. It isn't something you have to wait for Sunday to come around. It is Friday brought to completion. It is finished. And tetelestai is a word that is taken from Genesis, that on the seventh day God finished his work. It is also the same word in Greek about finishing. So the Jesus on the cross is kind of cueing us into a Sabbath narrative when he shouts tetelestai triumphantly, and again then to anchor Sabbath meanings in the commitment that God has made, and then so I want to retrieve, resurrection morning. Of course, I'm not disparaging resurrection morning. I just do not want us to miss out on that moment on Friday when he shouts tetelestai, because he shifts. Don't wait for Sunday to be joyous. Be joyous on Friday night. Be joyous that Friday afternoon. It is finished, and something brought to completion. What Jesus brings to completion there is that all the misconceptions, all the misunderstandings, all the wrong ideas we had about God, they have been defeated by Jesus in his way of representing God in the Gospel of John. So I think these things fit together to make us, there should be no anxiety about continuity here, and the Sabbath sort of surviving throughout till the end of time as a mediator, a blessing, as a commandment, and an enormous blessing if we view it through the lens of the divine commitment.
So amazing. Well, thank you so, so much, Dr. Tonstad, for talking to us. Definitely a blessing for me, and just hearing how you think about things, and just how you've reframed the Sabbath to, one, continue to be a relevant sign, but also two, to focus on God's love for us and on His commitment to us. Super powerful. So yeah, thank you for taking the time to talk to us.
And thank you for inviting me. And I just wish all of you well and all the blessings in the world on your pursuits, your studies, and your ministry. All the best to all of you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much. It was wonderful to have you.
Thank
And
you.
happy Sabbath.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Yeah.
God bless you.
Thank you. Bye bye. Bye bye.